A single sentence posted by US President Donald Trump was enough to expose how fragile the North American trade balance truly is. If Canada makes a deal with China, all Canadian goods entering the United States will face a 100% tariff. This was not an economic assessment. It was not the conclusion of a policy review or the summary of a negotiation brief. It was a declaration of power. And the tone of that declaration did not frame Canada as a trade partner, but as an actor stepping beyond an invisible boundary. The shock created by this threat went far beyond numbers and percentages, because what Canada and China were discussing was never a comprehensive free trade agreement. There was no signed pact, no binding framework, no sweeping market integration. What existed was limited, technical, and reversible. Reduced tariffs on select agricultural exports, particularly canola. A controlled and capped entry for Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market. That was the extent of it. Yet the response from Washington was immediate, aggressive, and absolute. Because the issue was never trade, the issue was direction. For decades, Canada's economic reality has been defined by a single gravitational center. The majority of its exports flowed south. Supply chains were built vertically, not globally. Prosperity became synonymous with access, and access depended on remaining aligned with Washington. This arrangement was never written down, but it was understood. Canada would remain within the US economic orbit. In return, stability and market access would be guaranteed. That unwritten agreement held for generations, until the word China entered the equation. In American political thinking, China is not simply another trade partner. It is a challenger, an alternative system, and perhaps most unsettling of all, a door that others might choose to open. Canada's limited engagement with China was not perceived in Washington as an economic maneuver, but as a symbolic shift. It suggested the possibility of choice, and it is that possibility that triggers the strongest reaction. This is why Trump's response was so disproportionate. A 100% tariff is not a technical correction. It is a shock tactic, a deterrent. A message not only to Canada but to every country watching closely, to Europe, to Asia, to all US allies quietly considering diversification. The message is simple and unmistakable. Seek alternatives, and you will pay a price. At this point, tariffs cease to function as economic tools. They become instruments of discipline, not designed to balance trade flows but to shape behavior. Trump's language reflects this shift clearly. He was not saying Canada made a bad deal. He was saying Canada was moving in the wrong direction. What makes this moment even more revealing is that Trump initially showed no such hostility. When the Canada-China discussions first surfaced, his reaction was neutral, even permissive. He suggested that Canada pursuing trade opportunities was reasonable. Then, almost overnight, the narrative changed. The same agreement was suddenly framed as an existential threat. That reversal exposes the real motivation behind the threat. This was not a trade response. It was a loyalty test. Canada now finds itself confronting a question that extends far beyond the present dispute. In an era where global power is fragmenting, how much independence can a mid-sized economy afford? Does reliance on a single dominant partner guarantee security, or does it create vulnerability? Is diversification an act of strategic foresight or an unnecessary provocation? And perhaps most importantly, what is the cost of even asking these questions? Trump's threat offered an implicit answer. Ask the wrong questions, and the consequences will follow. Yet the intended audience for this message was not only Canada, it was domestic. This rhetoric plays directly to an American political narrative that equates strength with control and resolve with punishment. Demonstrating the ability to discipline allies is part of projecting dominance. In this framework, Canada is not the ultimate target. It is an example, a warning sign placed in plain view. And that is precisely why the threat matters, regardless of whether it is ever implemented, because the effect has already been achieved. The signal has been sent. Economic relationships are no longer governed solely by contracts and numbers, but by alignment and obedience. Some doors, it seems, become dangerous the moment you even glance at them. For Canada, the dilemma is stark and unavoidable. Is long-term survival best secured by remaining bound to a single axis of power, or by accepting short-term risk in exchange for strategic flexibility? That question remains unanswered, but the threat itself has already entered history. What ultimately pushed this situation from quiet tension into open confrontation was not a trade document. It was not a tariff schedule or a customs quota, it was a speech. And more importantly, it was the timing of that speech. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, Canada's Prime Minister stood on a global stage and articulated something that many leaders privately acknowledge but rarely state so directly. He spoke of a fractured global order, of a world no longer organized around a single center of gravity, of middle powers needing to cooperate, align and protect themselves in an environment where predictability had collapsed. The language was measured, diplomatic, and carefully constructed. The United States was never mentioned by name. But the message was unmistakable. The old system no longer works as it once did. In isolation, the speech sounded like a reflection on global uncertainty. In context, it landed as a challenge, not a confrontation, but something more dangerous, a reframing, because when a close ally publicly acknowledges that the rules of the game have changed, it forces everyone listening to confront an uncomfortable possibility. That loyalty may no longer be automatic. That alignment may no longer be permanent. This is where tone matters more than substance. Canada's engagement with China could have remained a technical footnote, a quiet adjustment, discussed in trade circles and farm associations, largely invisible to the public. But Davos changed the framing. It transformed a narrow economic move into a broader statement about autonomy. And in Washington, autonomy from US leadership is often interpreted not as independence, but as defiance. The reaction from Donald Trump followed a familiar pattern. Language became personal. The Prime Minister was no longer addressed by title, but diminished rhetorically. Canada was no longer described as a partner, but as dependent. The subtext was clear. Prosperity was being reframed as a favor, not a shared outcome, and favors, by definition, can be withdrawn. This is not new, but it is becoming more explicit. For decades, global trade functioned under the assumption that rules constrained power. Agreements created predictability, institutions softened asymmetry, smaller economies accepted limitations in exchange for stability. But that assumption has been eroding. What Davos revealed was not a sudden collapse, but an acknowledgement that the erosion is already far along. And that acknowledgement was intolerable to a political worldview built on hierarchy. Trump's irritation was not about canola or electric vehicles. It was about narrative control. Who gets to define the global order? Who gets to declare when it is broken? When a US ally states publicly that the system has failed, it implicitly questions the legitimacy of the power that once anchored it. From this perspective, the tariff threat becomes easier to understand. It was not a response to an action, but to an idea. The idea that alignment is optional. The idea that economic survival might be possible without absolute dependence. Ideas are harder to counter than policies. You cannot renegotiate them quietly. You cannot sanction them away. You can only attempt to discredit them or make an example of those who voiced them. Canada, in this moment, became that example. What followed was a rhetorical escalation that revealed how fragile the alliance had become. Statements emphasizing that Canada lives because of the United States. Implications that sovereignty is conditional, that success is borrowed, not earned. This language is not accidental. T is designed to reassert hierarchy at a moment when hierarchy feels threatened. Yet what makes this dynamic particularly dangerous is that it misreads the underlying reality. Canada is not attempting to replace the United States with China. It is attempting to reduce vulnerability. That distinction matters, but in a zero-sum worldview, there is no difference between diversification and betrayal. This is where middle powers find themselves trapped. On one side is economic concentration, which offers stability until it doesn't. On the other is diversification, which offers resilience at the cost of friction. Davos was not a declaration of independence. It was a warning that the cost of dependence has risen. But warnings, when heard by insecure power, are often interpreted as threats. The tension now visible between Ottawa and Washington is therefore not an anomaly. It is a preview. As global supply chains fragment and geopolitical rivalry intensifies, more countries will face similar choices. Speak carefully and remain protected, or speak honestly and risk retaliation. And the most unsettling part is that there is no neutral ground. Silence can be interpreted as submission. Speech can be interpreted as provocation. Even restraint carries risk. Trump's response, framed as economic punishment, is ultimately about restoring deterrence. It is a signal meant to travel beyond Canada, to remind allies that autonomy has limits. That deviation will be noticed, and that consequences will be swift, loud, and personal. But there is a paradox embedded in this approach. The harder power pushes to enforce loyalty, the more visible the cost of that loyalty becomes. Each threat reveals the leverage behind the relationship. Each warning forces smaller states to calculate whether the protection they receive is worth the vulnerability it creates. Davos did not create this tension, it exposed it. And now Canada is navigating a landscape where words carry weight equal to policies, and where even acknowledging uncertainty can trigger confrontation. The trade dispute may still be negotiated, tariffs may never materialize, but the shift in tone has already done its work. Because once an ally is reminded that its prosperity is conditional, it cannot forget it. If you want to stay more informed, don't forget to subscribe to my channel.